Good afternoon. I'm Dr.Anju Professor in the Department of Anatomy at Sri Lakshminarayan Institute of Medical Sciences under Bharat Institute of Higher Education and Research. In today's class, we will discuss the functional components of cranial nerve nuclei and their nuclei which are lying in the brainstem. The objectives which will be covered in today's class are embryology, functional components, cranial nerve nuclei, their functional correlation, and the 12 cranial nerves. During development, the neural tube develops a depression along the central canal called sulcus limigens. It divides the developing neurons along the central canal into a dorsal alar plate shown with the blue color and a ventral basal plate shown with the pink color. The neurons in the alar plate are sensory neurons, whereas those in the basal plate are motor neurons. The aggregation of these neurons lead to formation of cranial nerve nuclei. As the neural tube opens up to accommodate the larger number of neurons in the brainstem, the functional components now come to life from medial to lateral side as somatic efferent, bronchiomotor, autonomic or the parasympathetic, and more laterally are the afferent components, that is visceral, somatic, and the spatial afferent. The 12 cranial nerves are shown in this slide with different colors to demarcate their nature. The nerves which are shown with red color are purely sensory. Those with green color are purely motor, whereas those with black color are mixed cranial nerves. The forebrain gives origin to the first and the second cranial nerve, whereas from the brainstem arise the third and the fourth cranial nerve. The trigeminal fifth cranial nerve arises from the pons. At the pontomedullary junction, we have from medial to lateral side origin of 6th, 7th and the 8th cranial nerve, whereas from the medulla oblongata arise the 9th, 10th, 11th and the 12th cranial nerves. As these cranial nerves are being formed from the nuclei in the brainstem, a single nerve may receive fibers from multiple nuclei, which is especially true as in the case of the mixed cranial nerves, whereas one cranial nucleus may give fibers to multiple nerves. The arrangement of the cranial nerve nuclei is more prominent or more important for the formation of different functional aspects of the cranial nerves. The trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve are the nerves which innervate the muscles arising from the pharyngeal arches, whereas the parasympathetic cranial outflow is carried through the oculomotor, facial and the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. The functional component, which is medialmost, is somatic efferent. This is purely motor, and the nerve nuclei, which are belonging to somatic efferent component, are oculomotor nucleus in the upper midbrain, trochlear nucleus in the lower midbrain, abducent nucleus in the lower pons, and hypoglossal nucleus in the midbrain. The second component is spatial visceral efferent, which is bronchiomotor. The nuclei which belong to this component are the motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve in the upper pons, the facial nerve nucleus in the lower pons, nucleus ambiguous giving fibers to the ninth and 10th cranial nerve, and the spinal accessory nucleus for the 11th cranial nerve. The third component is general visceral efferent. This component is nothing but controlling the autonomic or the parasympathetic part of the cranial outflow. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus in the midbrain gives fibers to the oculomotor or third cranial nerve. Superior and inferior salivatory nucleus give fiber to the seventh and the ninth cranial nerve. The inferior salivatory nucleus fibers which pass through the ninth or glossopharyngeal nerve relay in the otic area and then supply to the parotid gland. The superior salivatory nuclei fibers running through the facial nerve relay in the submandibular area to supply to the submandibular and sublingual salivary. The parasympathetic fibers from Edinger-Westphal nucleus running through the oculomotor nerve relay in the ciliary ganglion and they will supply the parasympathetic fibers to the intraocular muscles. The dorsal vagal nucleus in the medulla gives parasympathetic fibers to the vagus nerve, which innervates the visceral structures in the neck, thoracic region, abdomen, including the structures arising from foregut and midgut. The general visceral afferent and the spatial visceral afferent components are represented by solitary nucleus of the medulla. They receive visceral efferents or visceral inputs from the ninth and the 10th cranial nerve through solitary tract. The upper part of the nucleus is the designated part for the taste fibers. So these taste fibers are carried through the 7th cranial nerve, 9th and the 10th cranial nerve. In this diagram, we can see the motor fibers shown with the pink color. So we see the upper medulla here, upper part of the medulla oblongata. We see the fibers of 12th cranial nerve. Below that, we see the 11th cranial nerve, then the 10th and the 9th cranial nerve. At the pontomedullary junction, we see the 8th and the 7th cranial nerve. From the pons, the 5th cranial nerve. Then the lower midbrain, we see the trochlear nerve, the only nerve which is arising from the dorsal surface, and then above that we see from the upper midbrain the origin of the third cranial nerve. In the second diagram, we see the sensory fibers shown with the blue color. We see the fibers from the nuclei of the 5th cranial nerve, then the 7th and the 9th, the 8th cranial nerve and the 10th cranial nerve. The general somatic afferent fibers are represented in the trigeminal nerve. These are arising from the main sensory nucleus, the spinal nucleus, respectively from the upper pons and the spinal nucleus being from the pons and the medulla. The mesencephalic nucleus extends from pons to the midbrain. The spatial sensory afferent component is represented in olfactory and optic nerve. In case of the 8th cranial nerve, that is the vestibulocochlear nerve, the cochlear and vestibular nuclei receive fibers and are located at the frontomedullary junction. The sensory fibers are reaching these nuclei from the vestibule and the cochlea of the inner ear. During the development of the hindbrain, two significant events are occurring, and this is widening of the fourth ventricle, which has given rise to this mediolateral arrangement. The different components thus lie from medial to lateral side, and we see them in this diagram to correlate with the specific nuclei. The first is the somatic efferent, which is having the oculomotor and the trochlear nucleus in midbrain, abducent nucleus in pons, and the hypoglossal nucleus in medulla oblongata. The spatial visceral efferent, the second component, is having the motor nucleus of trigeminal, motor nucleus of facial, and nucleus ambiguous for 9th, 10th, and 11th cranial nerve. The general visceral efferent parasympathetic fibers are arising from irregular vesical nucleus in the midbrain, the lacrimetal nucleus, and the superior and inferior salivatory nucleus in the pons, and dorsal nucleus of vagus for the 10th cranial nerve from the medulla oblongata. The mixed nucleus for spatial visceral afferent and general visceral afferent is nucleus of fractus solitarius, which gives fibers to the 7th, 9th, and the 10th cranial nerve, which is carrying taste sensation. The 7th cranial nerve carrying taste fibers from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, 9th from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and the 10th cranial nerve carrying taste sensation from the mandible, that is the posterior most part. The general somatic afferent is responsible for general sensation from the face and neck, and these are carried by the trigeminal sensory component of the trigeminal nerve. And the nuclei which are representing these components are the mesencephalic nucleus, principal sensory nucleus, and spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The spatial somatic afferent nuclei are the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei. So these are the general and the spatial efferent fibers. The general visceral and the spatial visceral afferent fibers, then the general somatic and the spatial somatic afferent fibers. The nuclei of each of these functional components, as we have already discussed with the help of diagram, are for general somatic efferent, the 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 12th nucleus, which we can see in this diagram right in the midline shown with the red color, followed by more laterally the nuclei of the with blue color, which are the superior salivatory nucleus and the inferior salivatory nucleus, followed by dorsal nucleus of vagus. More laterally on motor side, we have the motor nucleus of trigeminal, motor nucleus of facial, and the nucleus ambiguous. On the sensory side, we have the nucleus of fractus solitarius and the mesencephalic, chief sensory, and the spinal nucleus of trigeminal. What we have to understand here is, though in this diagram the motor nuclei are shown on one side and sensory nuclei are shown on the other side, in the brain we have both the nuclei, sensory and motor, equally on the both sides, on right side as well as left side. Only for the simplification or for the understanding, the sensory nuclei are shown on one side and motor nuclei are on other side. But in life, in C2. They are paired and present on both sides. The nuclei which are giving fibers to the 7th, 9th and 10th cranial nerve are for the taste sensation are represented by a single nucleus, as we already said. So we have the taste sensation coming from 7th, 9th and 10th cranial nerve, and these all are reaching to the nucleus of factor solitarius. So here we see how these fibers are reaching to a single nucleus, and the nuclei on both sides of the brain, the right half and the left half of the brainstem, are connected through a commissural nucleus of vagus nerve. Similarly, we have the trigeminal nerve, which is having the sensory fibers which are reaching to chief sensory nucleus in the region of the tegmentum of the pons. The spinal nucleus in the spinal sensory nucleus in the upper part of the spinal cord up to C2, and the mesencephalic nucleus again in the pons and midbrain. These nuclei are receiving the sensory fibers from the skin of face and the mucous membrane of mouth and nose. Along with these sensory nuclei, there is a motor nucleus for the trigeminal nerve, which is responsible for the branchiomotor muscles, that is the muscles arising from first branchial arch. So here we see the sensory fibers which are shown reaching to the sensory nuclei shown with the pink color, and the motor fibers being released from the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So this is how the trigeminal nerve becomes a mixed nerve. Thus, to enumerate and or to conclude, we here have a table. So first cranial nerve or the olfactory nerve has functional component, spatial, somatic, afferent. There are no nuclei, as these first and second cranial nerve are arising from forebrain. Their distribution is in the olfactory epithelium, and the function that it is doing is the sensation of smell. Second cranial nerve, optic nerve, also has spatial somatic afferent from the retina of eyeball, and it has special function of vision. The third cranial nerve or the oculomotor nerve has the somatic efferent, which is arising from the oculomotor nucleus, and these fibers, which are motor fibers, are supplying to all the extrinsic muscles of eye except lateral rectus, which is supplied by the sixth cranial nerve, that is abducens, and superior oblique, which is supplied by fourth cranial nerve, that is trochlear. These muscles are responsible for movement of the eyeball. The second component in the oculomotor nerve is a general visceral efferent. This parasympathetic component is contributed by Edinger-Westphal nucleus located in the midbrain, and these fibers run along the oculomotor nerve, relay in the ciliary ganglion, and from there they post ganglionic fibers will supply to sphincter pupillae and dilator pupillae. These are the intrinsic muscles within the eyeball, which are responsible for constriction and dilatation of pupil for accommodation. The trochlear nerve has single component, that is somatic efferent, coming from the trochlear nucleus in the lower part of the brain. It supplies to superior oblique muscle of eyeball, which is responsible for movement of the eyeball. The fifth cranial nerve, that is trigeminal, has two components. One is spatial visceral efferent, which is bronchomotor, coming from the motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve and is supplying to the muscles that develop from the muscle component of the first branchial arch, which are the muscles of mastication that are responsible for movements of mandible which occur during speech as well as during the chewing of the food, that is mastication. The second sensory component of the trigeminal nerve is represented by general somatic afferent, and there are three nuclei which are contributing to it. One is chief sensory nucleus, which carries touch sensation from the skin of face and the mucous membrane of mouth and nose. The spinal nucleus, which receives the pain and temperature sensation from the same area, whereas the mesencephalic nucleus receives proprioceptive sensation from the muscles of mastication. Now the sixth cranial nerve. The sixth cranial nerve is the abducent nerve. It is purely motor, so it has only one component, that is somatic efferent. The fibers of abducent nerve innervate the lateral rectus muscular fiber, which is controlling the abduction movement of the eyeball. Then the seventh cranial nerve. Seventh is the mixed cranial nerve. The facial nerve has general visceral efferent. The parasympathetic component of the nerve is arising from superior salivatory nucleus. The fibers are secretomotor. They relay in submandibular ganglia and supply to the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. The second component is spatial visceral efferent, which arise from motor nucleus of the fascia, and the muscles which are innervated by this are arising from the muscle component of the second branchial arch. These are muscles of facial expression, stylohyoid muscle, posterior belly of digastric, platysma, and stapedius. These muscles are responsible for facial expression as well as for elevation of higher bone. The third component of facial nerve is spatial visceral afferent. These are spatial sensation from viscera. In the case of facial nerve, it is the taste sensation from the anterior two-thirds of tongue to the valate papilla. The fibers run through the tractus solitarius to the nucleus of tractus solitarius. The fourth component is general somatic afferent, which are relaying the exteroceptive sensation from part of skin of the external ear into the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Then the eighth cranial nerve, that is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This nerve is having only the sensory component, and this component is spatial somatic afferent. It is receiving the hearing sensation from the cochlea of inner ear, relaying into the cochlear nucleus, equilibrium and balance through the vestibular receptors of the semicircular ducts, utricle and saccule of the internal ear, relaying into vestibular nuclei. Then is the another mixed nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal, the cranial nerve number 9. This ninth cranial nerve has spatial visceral efferent, which is nothing but bronchiomotor. The fibers are arising from nucleus ambiguous and are supplying to the muscle, which is arising from the muscle developing from third pharyngeal arch, that is the stylopharyngeus, and the muscle is responsible for elevation of larynx. The second component is general visceral efferent. These are the fibers which are arising from inferior salivatory nucleus. They relay in otic ganglia, and the secretomotor fibers innervate the parotid salivary gland. The general visceral afferent component is represented by nucleus of tractus solitarius. In the lower part, the fibers are going through the glossopharyngeal nerve and innervating the posterior one-third of tongue and the pharynx. They receive not only the taste sensation but also the general sensation such as touch, pain, temperature from posterior one-third of tongue. The last component of glossopharyngeal nerve is spatial visceral afferent. That is, the taste sensation of the through the nucleus of rectus solitarius, which is in the upper part. So these were the fibers of and the nuclei and the functional component of glossopharyngeal. Now we move on to the next cranial nerve, that is the 10th cranial nerve or the vagus. It also has both sensory and motor components. To begin with, the first component of the vagus is spatial visceral efferent or bronchiomotor, represented by nucleus ambiguus, and the muscles that develop from the pharyngeal arches, such as the muscles of palate, pharynx, and larynx, are innervated by the vagus nerve. So this is basically a motor component of vagus nerve. Second motor component is general visceral efferent. It is arising from dorsal nucleus of vagus and is innervating the smooth muscles and glands of thoracic and abdominal viscera. And these fibers are motor or secretomotor to the bronchial tree as well as the gut, whereas they are inhibitory to the cardiac muscles. The general visceral afferent component is represented by nucleus of rectus solitarius, which is for general sensation from the thoracic and abdominal viscera, and the new spatial visceral afferent to the same nucleus for the taste sensation from posteriormost part of the tongue and the epiglottis or the vallecula. Then comes the 11th cranial nerve, that is the spinal accessory nerve. It has two components. One is spatial visceral afferent. This bronchiomotor component is again from the nucleus ambiguus. So we can see that the nucleus ambiguus is contributing fibers to 9th, 10th, and 11th cranial nerve, and all these fibers are spatial visceral efferent, supplying to the muscles arising from branchial arches. So in the case of 11th cranial nerve, these muscles are muscles of palate, pharynx, and larynx, which are responsible for their movement. The second component is general somatic efferent, which is arising from spinal nucleus of accessory nerve. The nucleus is long and it is a gray column which is extending up to upper 5 cervical spinal segments. It innervates the muscles trapezius and sternocleidomastoid, which are responsible for movements of head and shoulder. Now the last cranial nerve, that is the 12th cranial nerve, the name is hypoglossal nerve. It's a purely motor nerve, so it has only one component, and that is somatic efferent. The hypoglossal nerve supplies to all the muscles of the tongue except the palatoglossus, and these muscles are responsible for movements of the tongue. So in this way, we now conclude the class. The takeaway message of the class is the functional components are arranged from medial to lateral side as first the motor components, then the sensory components. The motor components in the midline are somatic efferent for 3rd, 4th, 6th, and the 12th cranial nerve, whereas the somatic spatial visceral efferent are the motor components for the muscles arising from pharyngeal arches to the 5th, 7th, 9th, 10th, and 11th cranial nerve. The secretomotor or parasympathetic fibers are through the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th cranial nerve. Now about the sensory components. The sensory component, both general visceral afferent and general spatial visceral afferent are together in the nucleus of rectus solitarius, and they receive general as well as spatial sensation through the 7th, 9th, and the 10th cranial nerve. The next component is general somatic afferent. So the muscles or the structures which are arising from the body wall And these sensations of touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception of muscle, these are carried to the mesencephalic nucleus, the principal sensory nucleus, and spinal nucleus of the trigeminal. And the last component, the lateral most, is purely for the purely sensory nerves, that is the spatial somatic afferent. The spatial somatic afferent is the component for first, second, and the eighth cranial nerve, that is the olfactory, optic, and the vestibulocochlear nerve. Since the olfactory and the optic nerves are arising from forebrain, their functional components and nuclei are not represented in the midbrain, which are shown in this diagram. The spatial somatic afferent component is present in the vestibular nuclei, which is responsible for the maintenance of the balance, and the cochlear nuclei, which are responsible for hearing. So, with this, we conclude the today's class, and we have to revise the different functional components of each cranial nerve along with their cranial nerve nuclei, the innervation of fibers to these different areas, and the function of these different fibers at the periphery, whether they are sensory or motor. So either the chart can be explained from periphery towards the central or from center towards the periphery. Thank you.